Today we're going to talk about longitudinal designs and program evaluation, which is probably one of the primary applied setting for longitudinal designs. The objectives for today are to explain the uses of longitudinal designs, describe the elements of an effective program evaluation, and define time-based threats to internal validity and describe ways to minimize them. Again, these is just like I mentioned last time, all the other sorts of things like experimenter effects, subject or participant effects, selection effects still apply here. What we're going to talk about today are the unique threats to internal validity that come up with longitudinal designs. And then we're going to provide you with the selection of topics for the individual report. So today we're going to focus again, this is another day where we're talking about revisiting the idea of research design. We're focusing on what are called longitudinal, or if you're in a more British location, sometimes it's pronounced longitudinal for whatever reason. But again, all that means is something where we have multiple data collections on the same people that are separated in time. So if a person is in our sample at one time, maybe we measure them again 2 weeks later, or 6 months, or a year, or however often we are sampling them. Occasionally, this overlaps with what in economics is called a panel design, which is a specific kind of longitudinal design. Accidentally went ahead. This is often used to evaluate new programs. And by new programs, this could be a training program. It could be a new sort of staffing regime, like if we introduce a new personnel, like a new kind of interview or personnel test, or really any intervention that we might do. Like if we introduced a new incentive system, we might use this kind of a design to evaluate its effectiveness. So the example, like the Facebook research that we talked about, I think that was last time, was an example of longitudinal design. Well, one of them was anyways. Researchers have found a correlation between Facebook use and negative emotions. In particular, the more time people spend perusing their friends' Facebook pages, the more they experience feelings of jealousy, loneliness, and low self-esteem. Reverse causation is a threat to internal validity. As I just mentioned, the idea here is if we measure these variables at the same time, we can't tell whether or not spending time on Facebook makes you feel bad, or if feeling bad makes you spend time on Facebook, or if they're just bidirectionally related. When you feel bad, you go to Facebook, it makes you feel worse, and so you spend more time on Facebook. Whatever. If we measure these at the same time, we can't tell the difference between any of those explanations. If, on the other hand, like the cross study, we follow Facebook users for 2 weeks. Again, in this case, they did feelings of well-being, worry, and loneliness 5 times per day, frequency of Facebook use, and ratings of life satisfaction. And this is at the beginning and end of the study. So what emerged was clearly a high use of Facebook was associated with lower ratings of well-being shortly afterwards. High Facebook use was also related to a decline in life satisfaction over the course of the study. And so what that means is like if, let's say, this is your time 1 life satisfaction, this is your time 2 life satisfaction. So it went down. And like the more time you spent on Facebook, the more likely it was to go or the more steep the decrease was. Right? So that's what we can see there. And so this was a longitudinal study, so we can see that the Facebook usage was associated with a decline over time. And moreover, that like when people were on Facebook, they then afterwards reported feeling worse, as opposed to they didn't report feeling worse and then go to Facebook. Right? So this can help rule out some aspects of reverse causality, and therefore provides stronger evidence that it is the Facebook use that causes the negative feelings rather than the other way around. And we cannot do that if we just measure, like if we say at the end of a day or at the end of like a study period, if we just give you a survey and ask you on average how many hours a week do you spend on Facebook, and to tell us how you felt over the last week. We might see that people who spend a lot of time on Facebook feel worse. Right, okay, but that could go either way. Whereas if we study them over time, we can see you were using Facebook a lot and you felt worse than you did before. Oh. Um, Again, helps to rule out reverse causation. Program evaluation, like I said, this could be any kind of program that we might want to introduce. So we could introduce merit pay or some other sort of incentive system. We could try to start an EAP or an at-work program to reduce stress, and like maybe some sort of exercise, meditation, or stretching program, whatever. Um, or we could be encouraging employees to recycle, or as happened over the last year here at Concordia, encouraging, like educating and encouraging people to compost more waste. Longitudinal designs are used to assess these kinds of interventions because, again, the idea here is we might see, like, we might be able to see if we just introduce a program and then measure how much people are doing those things, we have no evidence for change. Whereas if we measure, introduce, and then measure again, we can at least see change. And if we have a control group, we can see whether they changed to the same degree as the experimental group where we did the intervention. Even if the control group, and again, this is the case where the biggest concern here is oftentimes with these sort of studies, either we can't get a control group at all, or the control group is not randomly assigned in like we may have to use like to go back, I mentioned some other Greenberg studies, I think, in the first week. So the Greenberg study was the insurance office studies. Greenberg also had some other sorts of studies on the same sorts of topics, like where he looked at, say, organizational fairness or justice and status and employee theft. And in those cases, what he had was several different groups, but they were at different locations, different physical locations. They were at paper mills, well, paper plants, and so they were at different locations. So again, the people are not necessarily exactly comparable the way they would be with proper experimental control and through random assignment. So we have that idea, like, do exams have you stressed out? Petting a friendly dog will help, right? Um, the basic idea here is we want to see pet a dog stress level, but that could be reverse causation, right? It could be that people who have lower stress are not freaked out and therefore go to pet the dogs, right? Whereas like somebody who's just really high stress, it's like, no, I don't have time to go pet a dog. So it could be that lower stress is predicting using this pet therapy program as opposed to pet therapy reducing stress. Whereas if we're able to do, that's what I was saying, a longitudinal study would increase our confidence about what is the cause and what is the effect, right? Because what we'd see is people would come in and we'd measure their stress before and after the pet therapy experience. And ideally, we would also have a control group, and ideally, that control group uh, would be randomly assigned. Chances are they're not. Like, so here's what like the ideal. We're going to call it. Actually, sorry. So the basic idea here is we want something like this. So we've got exit time 1, then we've got our treatment intervention, and exit time 2. And then let's just call it C. And then if we have a control group, here's what we have. We have control group at time 1, control group at time 2, and no intervention. And what we'd want to see is that there is, ideally, we want to see that at time 1, at least up to like statistical uncertainty, X is equivalent or equal to, well, the experimental group is equal to the control group, and that after the intervention, that X is not equivalent to the control group. And ideally, we want the change to be in the direction that we expect, right? So we wouldn't want to see this. So we wouldn't want to see like for everything to be consistent with our hypotheses, say about pet therapy, so that we come in, like we have a control group and an experimental come in at time one, they're pretty much the same. The experimental group interacts with the pets and has a pleasant time with them. And what we would want to see is that their stress was then lower than it was at time one, and that the stress for the control group was no different, or at least statistically equivalent. Whereas if we saw that the experimental group was different from the control group, but had higher stress than they did at time one, then we'd have a problem. Now, we could also have this be the case where, I'm just going to cross this out. So we could have the case that since these things are not experimental, we could have that x at time one is greater than the control at time one, and that so x at time two is still greater than the control at time two, but that x at time two is less than x at time one, right? So we see this. So the idea here is, and this gets back to that sort of like good hospitals often have sicker patients. So even though they do better treatment, they might still have worse outcomes. So if there is a selection effect going on, so more like our control group is just people who we happen to get the measures on who are not going to pet therapy, and the people who are going to pet therapy are in fact stressed. So that exit time one, the people using pet therapy have higher stress than those at the control group at time one. They might still have greater stress than the control group at time two, but if their own time two is significantly less than their own stress at time one, then this is still consistent. This would still be consistent with the hypothesis that pet therapy reduces stress. And what we would, because in contrast, what we would expect is that at least, again, up to statistical uncertainty, the control group at time one is equal to the control group at time two. And the logic of this can be somewhat confusing. I mean, in the simplest case, it's all very straightforward, that basically x1, c1, and c2 are all statistically indistinguishable, and that x2 is higher or lower than the others as according to whatever direction is hypothesized. That's the easiest case because that means that our control and our experimental group were comparable, that there was no meaningful change for our control group and there was meaningful change for our experimental group. But again, things can get a lot more complicated than that. And it's just a matter of we have to interpret the patterns correctly. So we want to see change in the, or at least to be consistent with our hypothesis, we want to see change in the experimental group that is consistent with the hypothesis and no meaningful change in the control group, even if, say, the experimental group and the control group are not comparable at time one. So here we go. With program evaluation, we first want to establish the goals of the intervention. So this could be proximal versus distal goals, right? So like for instance, if we're introducing, a safety training, we might have our long-term goal might be, cost savings due to reduced accidents. So that might be our distal goal. But our proximal goal is often just going to be a better knowledge of safety procedures, right? So something that we could test people on, that would be proximal. So our program is there to teach people how to follow or teach them the safety procedures and how to do the safety procedures. But that, like, just because they learn them doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to use them. So we want to see, like, ideally we want to see our proximal goals related to our distal goals in such a way that people, it's sometimes called transfer of training, people transfer the skills that they learned in the training to the workplace so that what they learned in the training program affects the distal goal. We also want to monitor the program. So for instance, if this is a training program, but we just have supervisors who are maybe like just handing out material and not doing anything to make sure that people are reading it, studying it, learning it, then the program is probably not going to be successful, and so that's why we typically want to monitor the program to make sure that it's actually being implemented correctly. And then our impact assessment. So we want to see that the outcomes happened as predicted. And we're going to typically assess those using longitudinal research designs. And then, we want to make decisions. So we want to recommend to like whether to continue the program because it's working as expected, terminate the program because maybe it's working opposite, like maybe our training program is making people actively less safe, in which case we might want to just immediately terminate the program, or modify the program. Maybe it's working but not as well as we expected it to, and so we need to change the way we are delivering the training, or incentivizing people to use the trained behaviors, things like that. So Esther Duflo, she's an economist who uses a lot of like program evaluation design. So imagine you have a few $1,000,000, you want to spend it on the poor, and how would you go about it? And this is in terms of like what's sometimes now called, I think, following the philosopher, the ethicist Peter Singer's terminology called effective altruism. Which the idea is, hey, yeah, sure, giving away your time, talents, or money is good. But it's all things being equal, it's best to put these towards things that are actually effective at accomplishing their goals. So, and in general, alleviating poverty is currently more guesswork than science. So the idea is we want to look at data to see the impact of particular kinds of aid on developing countries. That's what Esther Duflo here has done. She demonstrates that it's possible to know which development efforts help and if any of them hurt, which ones do that. So looking at social policy, she's been using randomized controls trials or using the idea that randomized controls trials revolutionized medicine. Like going back to probably first really serious thing here was a medical doctor and obstetrician named Semmelweis who realized that one reason that mothers frequently died in childbirth was because they were getting septic infections from doctors not washing their hands, like they do. They perform or just do clinical observations, tests on people, and so they would have possibly like things like staph infections on their hands from, say, like examining one patient, doing, say, a pelvic exam on one patient, and then going to a birthing chamber with another one, not washing their hands in between, and therefore transferring the staph infection to a different person. This is particularly dangerous in surgical intervention. So if you're doing a cesarean section, you'd get the staph infection. Inside sensitive tissues, which could become deeply infected, gangrenous, those sorts of things, possibly kill the mothers. So he did tests over a relatively short period of time where first he started washing his hands and noticed that his patients were dying at significantly lower rates, and then testing it out, like randomly introducing this idea to others. So, I mean, this wasn't even that long ago. Like we now take it for granted that doctors tend to sterilize themselves and their instruments in between patients, but that's a relatively new phenomenon. Not even. That was in the late 1800s, I believe. I've forgotten the exact dates now. I'll have to look it up. But anyways, so the idea here is that you could apply the same idea to social policy. So you can put any social innovations to the same kind of scientific tests that you would use for drugs, and that way you can get rid of the guesswork. You know what works, and hopefully why it doesn't, if it doesn't. So this is just the basic idea, like looking at longitudinal experiments saying like children not dying from malaria because of malaria immunization camps, and ones with and without incentives. So we're able to in that case, just to see, is there greater compliance? Like if we like basically provide people with incentives or rewards, payments or gifts for immunizing, does that affect things? And so here's further experiments with essentially anti-malaria. So anti-mosquito bed nets, how much should providers charge the customer? So the basic idea here is what we see here is the y-axis is future purchase of a net at $2, and this is the initial cost here on the x-axis. So if it's free, people have a 20% chance of repurchasing. If it's 65 cents, they have, between a 20 and about, looks like about a 24% probability of buying. And these bars here, those are error bars. So you can see those ones are pretty comparable to one another. At $1, this drops pretty substantially. Like these confidence intervals overlap, but not by a lot. And then the probability actually goes up to $2 and then down. But here we see like just in net, our highest probability of repurchase is at 65 cents. And that's the basic idea here is that, there's a number of things that could be going on. So this is kind of a foot in the door effect, is that you get people to invest in this, and therefore when they see that it works, they're more likely to reinvest. But again, even here, everything's pretty, like $1 is less effective for some reason, but you can see it also has pretty wide error bars. But we've got only slight decreases from being free overall up to $2, and then at $3 it drops again. And here we've got the extra year of schooling per $100. And so the basic idea here is what's the best way of spending aid money to encourage children to stay in school longer. Okay, so like the kinds of things that people say, like hiring extra teachers, there's a little bit of a return, school meals, about like more than like getting almost twice as big a return as hiring an extra teacher. So yeah, having people fed is good. Uniforms have very little effect. Scholarships, very little effect. Almost nothing from closed circuit television and primary or secondary schools, like virtually nothing. Iron supplements seem to be better than anything else over here. Deworming though, so like we've got basically so far health interventions are pretty good, but actually providing people with information on the returns to additional schooling seems to have the most substantial impact. So that we get more people staying in school longer when you provide them info. Um, and here's, again, the basic idea that we got ideal longitudinal research designs, that we want a pre-measure, a post-measure, and follow-up measures for both a treatment and a control group. Why is the control group needed? Again, otherwise we can even see differences between the treatment group and the pre and post measure for the treatment group, but we don't know if it's really our intervention that had an effect. So for instance, like with the Morisano study, the goal setting study that we've talked about numerous times, if we only had an experimental group, so only a group that did the goal setting intervention, and their GPA did increase, we won't know if it's because of the intervention or just because maybe they had such a bad experience the previous semester, like maybe they were, you know, quote unquote scared straight, and so they worked a lot harder, and maybe that overlaps with why they're doing the goal setting intervention, right? It's like, well, I got to try everything. This is what's sometimes called isolating our variables by having the control group, when that the only difference between the control group and the treatment group, or the only systematic difference between the control group and the treatment group, is the intervention. That if we see some changes in the treatment group that we don't see in the control group, we have better evidence that it's whatever our treatment was, right? And how can we make the treatment group and the control groups initially similar? Well, the ideal way to do this is, again, random assignment. If we can't do that, we want to try to make sure that there's no major selection effects. So if we can't do random assignment, we want to make sure, like I described with the Greenberg study with the paper mills a few minutes ago, we want to try to make sure that they're as close to, like they may be different in some ways, but probably not in any systematic ways other than the location. And that means we can't rule things out. The other thing we can do is to assess lots of control variables, right? We can try to identify what are the most likely confounding variables, like I talked about last week, and we can control for those statistically. We can say even controlling for all of these pre-existing differences between our groups, we still see, an improvement in the treatment group and not in the control group. So those are things that we can do. And why should we ensure the treatment and the control group are initially similar? Well, again, if there are major differences between the groups, whatever differences we see might be attributable to those differences and not the intervention. But longitudinal designs don't always get that ideal. In fact, I'd say random assignment may not be possible, and a control group may not be possible. And without a control group, there are strong threats to internal validity. So now again, virtually all of these can be dealt with by having the control group. But the basic idea here is if we only have this, and oftentimes we don't even have that. And sometimes, and in fact, this is probably pretty common, like if you were ever interested in going to higher education in the United States, you pretty much have to take, say, some version of the SAT or the ACT, and there are lots of tests, or go to medical school, you have to take the MCAT, PCAT for pharmacy, or the DAT for dentistry. Like there's all these standardized tests, and there's lots of test prep companies, and they often do some kind of assessment to say, hey, we're like, our program is great. People who, sorry, I keep messing with my hair. Sorry about that. And a lot of times, all they do is this. They just say, like, how did people who took our program do? So no control group, no pre-treat, no pre-measure, and so we have no idea what's going on. They're just like, hey, this is the average score that people get who go through our program. Isn't it great? Which ignores the fact that the people who take the program tend to have more financial resources than those who don't, and lots of other features going for them. So anyways, what we really want, like I said, what we really, really ideally want is, and we want follow-up measures too, and that helps us to see whether or not whatever happened is stable. And if we are missing, especially here, our control group, we have these major threats to internal validity. History, which refers to impact from the world, maturation, which is just natural changes in the individual over time, and mortality, or probably more neutrally called attrition, so people dropping out of the study. So with Morisano here, this is the basic design. So we have our pre-measure is the winter term GPA. We have the intervention, which is the fall term goal setting versus control, and then the questionnaire, which was enthusiasm and negative emotion, and then the winter term GPA, which and the number of discontinued courses, right? So that's what we've got. And so both the control group and the experimental group, or the goal setting group, did their winter GPA, did the questionnaire, and did the winter term. And again, people were randomly assigned. Like everybody here, there was some selection here that everybody was on like academic, well, not probation, but it was academically at risk. But they didn't necessarily, but then once that was the case, these people were identified, they were randomly assigned to either the control or the goal setting. Goals of the intervention is proximal, improve grades with students on probation, and distal was to reduce university dropout rates. In the present longitudinal study, we explored the possibility that participation in a formalized personal goal setting program might serve as an effective intervention. Program monitoring and impact assessment, the intervention group learned goal setting and the control group did not. Internal validity issues, the goal setting group had improved academic performance, higher GPA, fewer discontinued courses, and less negative emotion. History as an alternative explanation. This would be the idea that maybe if it was an unusually, let's say, an unusually cold fall, or that there was something else going on. Like, hey, say there's a pandemic, and so everybody's stuck inside. So everybody's like, hey, might as well, like, if everybody's just like, might as well put more effort into my classes because what else have I got going on? So if we didn't have the control group, what we'd see is, okay, so our goal setting group, their grades went up, but that's just because independent of the program, they were just spending more time with their books, studying, working on their courses. With the control group, what we can see is the basic idea here is here's the both of them are like imagine both my fists are the control and the experimental group. This is their winter term GPA. Here after the intervention, let's say they both go up, but my control group did not go up as high as the experimental group. And again, the basic idea there would be that yes, there is a history effect, but the intervention has an effect on top of it. So the control group allows us to see that, whatever was going on in the world, it lets us observe its impact independently of the experimental group. And the same basic thing happens with maturation. Maturation is the same idea, but instead of it being something happening in the world that impacts the variables involved in the study, it's the the individuals themselves. So this could be things like learning, it could be boredom, it could be whatever. For instance, this is why with sort of like cognitive psychology experiments, a lot of times people will go through hundreds of trials before they start actually recording data because there's lots of mistakes and people have to learn the stimuli and response patterns and things like that. So they do those dozens to hundreds of trials, and so you have this basic idea that there's this learning curve up until that point, and then once people have mastered whatever the task that they're going to be doing is, then the actual study begins. And so then we can see all of those sorts of things, and that's really just saying there is a maturation effect. It's learning in that case, and we want to control it out. We just want to say we're going to give everybody the chance to learn the procedure, then we're going to start the experiment. Right, and this could be just the case, and the same thing could happen here. And again, the basic idea here is what we're worried about is maturation. The one thing that could happen is if the treatment impacts maturation. All right, so there's an interaction between whatever the maturation effect is and the treatment. Not much we can do about that. But if people are just like experiencing change within themselves over time, if the control group is comparable to the experimental group, the only difference between them is whatever the treatment is, and therefore any maturation that isn't being acted on by the treatment itself is going to happen for both groups. So, or at least on average, the same. So whether it's they're getting bored with the study, they're learning, they're growing, they're experiencing things, there you go. The issue, and that leads to, especially that boredom possibility, kind of leads to the third threat, which is mortality. And the basic idea here is mortality is people who drop out of the study. And the term comes from like the clinical and epidemiological literature, where it literally refers to mortality, like people dying at differential rates between the studies. But here it refers to, typically we're going to be talking about it in terms of attrition. So people leaving the study before it's done. And so if you have again, this can be a big thing. Like if the people who are doing the best in the study have a tendency to drop out, our intervention may look worse than it really would be if we were able to observe everyone. If people are doing the worst drop out, our intervention might wind up looking better than it would be if we were able to observe everyone the whole time. And again, the idea here is if we have a control group, it's not something where we can really control for mortality, but we can check how important it is as an explanation. Because again, all else being equal, if the intervention itself does not affect mortality, so it doesn't affect attrition, doesn't affect people leaving the study, then the rates of attrition between the experimental group and the control group should be about the same. So like, let's say if 7 people drop out of the 7% of participants drop out of the experimental treatment, then 7% should be about 7% should drop out of the control, right? Now again, it's never going to be exact, or will typically not be the exact same number, but they should be statistically indistinguishable. And so with a control group, we can check that, and we can at least have, and if there are major differences between them, we at least have some understanding of the degree to which attrition or mortality has limited the inferences that we can draw from the study. Again, explanations here. History effects could be things like bad weather maturation could be people becoming more responsible about studying personally. Although I think that kind of overlaps with my first explanation, although that one was more about, again, I used the pandemic as an explanation instead of bad weather, but you get the idea. And mortality here, when poor students tend to drop out, the outcomes improve, not because of the intervention, but just because the bad students dropped out, which is, again, like what I was saying before, is if the poorly performing participants drop out at a higher rate, the intervention winds up looking good, looking effective, even if it isn't, or even if it is effective, it looks more effective than it really is. Having the control group helps to rule out those threats, because we can see all these things should affect both groups equally if the experimental group and the control group are comparable at the beginning. Decision making. Again, this is an important part for applied purposes. Make this type of personal goal setting exercise available to university students. That's the recommendation here. It can lead to higher GPA, maintenance of a full course load, and lower negative emotions. What the authors did say is a longer follow-up period would allow researchers to examine whether the effects continue into subsequent years. Like, a basic idea here is, this study seems like basically shows that this kind of intervention does in fact appear to work pretty well, right? Works just fine. But the question is, will it work all the time? Yes or no? If we teach you how to set these personal goals, will you just do it, or do you need additional interventions every semester? That's the kind of idea that looks to see whether or not these sort of effects that we observe are stable over time. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And again, the longer the follow-up period, the better we can see this. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the final project, and I'll be posting information about it maybe as early as tomorrow, certainly this week. The final project is the capstone for the course, and we're going to use basically all the concepts that we talked about here. The learning objectives for the project are to apply the core concepts from research methods, position your research in the light of existing research on the same topic. So that's pretty comparable to what you're doing now as a team in assignment 1, and then overall communicate the purpose, method, results, and implications of your study in a way that is credible or seems reasonable to an informed audience and to business practitioners, right? So this isn't just about doing a good job on research methods, but like a paper like this is a bit of persuasive communication. You're going to be making recommendations based on the findings that you have, and you want to communicate those in a way that is compelling to an audience, right? You want to hook them, you want to make them read, you want to make them understand the findings and accept the implications and be interested in your recommendations, interested enough to at least look into following up on them and implementing them, or at least thinking that it would be reasonable to do so. So in terms of choosing your topic, actually, we're not going to worry about this. I'm probably going to, like, what I found is every semester this winds up being complicated, and if I just let people choose their own topic, it never turns out badly. So here's what we've got. So don't worry about that. Your topic variable will be your main independent or dependent variable. As far as I'm concerned, it just has to serve that role in each hypothesis, but it can shift. Your topic variable can be a dependent variable in some hypotheses and an independent variable in others, or the other way around. So you're going to select other variables from the same survey. So in general, survey A is a student survey. Survey B is an employee survey. So they're on different people. They're different samples. So you can't cross over between them. So if you choose a topic variable from survey A, you can use in your hypotheses any other variable on survey A, but not one from survey B, and the other way around. If you choose a topic variable from survey B, in any hypothesis, you can use any other variable on survey B, but you can't use one from survey A because they're different people. There's no linkage between them, so you can't test, like you can't compare or contrast or correlate anything between the two surveys. Just it's impossible. There's no logical connection, no logical, practical, or in fact any kind of connection between the two surveys. So once you pick a variable in survey A, you're stuck with variables from survey A. You pick a variable in survey B, you're stuck with variables on survey B. You'll have to provide it. You'll develop 3 bivariate hypotheses using those. In general, like if you wanted to develop a multivariate hypothesis or something using a third variable like a mediator or moderator, that's okay. If it's a mediator, you're probably going to want to break that down into 2 separate hypotheses, one where the mediator is an independent variable and one where it is one where the dependent variable is one where the mediator is a dependent variable and one where it is a independent variable, right? Like the basic idea being, I'll just reuse this guy. So if you have a mediation hypothesis, you'd have x to m, where m is the mediator, but it's the dependent variable in hypothesis 1, so that arrow labeled h1 there, and it's the independent variable in hypothesis 2. And that's for the purposes of this study, or this course, that would be fine. I have had students who do a moderated hypothesis in the past that has tended to require more in terms of office hours to explain what's going on, but you can do that, but you're not required to. And in fact, I would encourage people, unless this is something you really want to do, to stick with bivariate hypotheses, just because it's easier and it's more equivalent to what we're doing in class. So you need to develop 3 bivariate hypotheses. And again, there's nothing saying you can't do more, but that's the minimum. I have had at least one student in the past who did very, very poorly on this, like even though it was a well-researched and well-written paper, but they only did one hypothesis. So essentially they did a third of the project, and therefore they were pretty much capped at best at doing 33% on the final project. So don't shoot yourself in the foot. If you do more than that, that's not going to get you extra credit. But it could, but I'm not saying like if you have 4 hypotheses that you're desperate to test, go ahead. That's not going to count against you. But don't go out of there's not going to be any incentive for that either. And then for each one of those hypotheses, you need to provide a reasonable theoretical explanation from it, drawn from the background literature. So you can do library research using previously published studies, whether those are journal articles or dissertations, what have you. Preferably journal articles, just they're easier to find, usually easier to read. So go for that. But again, very similar to what you're doing in assignment 1, and then use the related data set to test your hypotheses and write those up, similar to what's happening in assignments 2 and 3. And then so you're going to draw conclusions and make recommendations to improve the organization. So that's basically the discussion section of a research report. And then a reminder, this is an individual project, so you're working on it on your own. This is essentially a way, like I said, it's essentially, you can think about this as a capstone. So it's a way of us seeing, assessing your internalization, knowledge, and skill of the basic topics of this course as an individual, how well you've mastered it. And this is for this semester. These are the survey topics. So, I'm going to record this for a bit, but I'll post these slides as well, so you'll be able to see it. But on survey A, again, this is the student survey over here. So survey A, I'm underlining it. That's the survey. Survey B, this is an employee survey. So survey A, we have healthy behaviors, intrinsic motivation, fear of failure, work overload, procrastination, negative stress mindset, positive stress mindset, and self-reported emotional intelligence. On survey B, Again, an employee survey, we have job satisfaction, job stress, coworker support, supportive leadership, organizational constraints, self-efficacy, and proactive behavior. So basically what you're looking at here is on either survey A or survey B, you're looking to find a variable to use as your topic variable, which is going to be essentially the central organizational plank of the paper. It's going to play a role in each one of your hypotheses, whether that's as an independent or dependent variable. I don't care. It can do both. If there's like sort of a mediation hypothesis that it's central to, so don't worry about that. Just you have to choose one, and then you can use in those hypotheses. You can like say you choose job satisfaction, right? So let's say I do that. You could have stress and leadership be other variables, but you can also use, there are other variables that are on these surveys that are not a part of, that are not eligible for topic variable status. So you don't have to necessarily for the other variable, like you have to choose your topic variable from one of these lists. But the other variables do not, they can all come from the list, but they don't have to. Like, sex/gender is a variable on both of these surveys. There's usually some sort of a semester, like semesters attended on the survey A, or tenure on survey B. There's a bunch of demographic variables. There's even some like survey type variables that aren't eligible for topic on the survey sometimes. And I actually just realized I'm not sure if there are any of those this semester. But anyways, so but these are just the ones, like your topic variable has to come from one of these lists. And any or all of these could be eligible for being the other non-topic variables involved in your three bivariate hypotheses. But you don't have to limit yourself to just the ones that are listed here for that. You can choose other variables that are on your chosen survey. So that's it for that. So that's what's going on here. And I want to thank people. Like I've gotten lots and lots of emails about assignment one, and it seems like that's been pretty helpful. So I'm really happy to do that. And again, if people are concerned that you have questions about any of the assignments or the individual project, feel free to always ask questions by email. But if you think that it's going to be better to try to schedule a Skype, phone call, or Zoom experience to talk about it, always good. I have prior to about on most days prior to about 2:45, I have pretty good availability, and I will try to accommodate you if you need that. But again, I tend to find it easier to answer questions by email. But if you think that it's something you're going to need to show me something, or that it's going to be easier for you to explain in spoken words rather than something you would write down, we can set up an office hours appointment. All right. Well, take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.